A bad executive decision, a public meltdown, even a middle-aged complaint can belong to Gen X and still get labeled boomer. The strange part is that the label often arrives before anyone has checked the person's actual generation. Picture a gray-haired manager dismissing remote work, or a customer exploding at a cashier over a minor inconvenience. Online, somebody calls them a boomer, and the argument feels settled before their birth year ever enters the conversation. At that point, boomer is doing more than naming a generation. It is naming a type of person. The label can bundle age, authority, money, stubbornness, entitlement, and resistance to change into one instantly recognizable villain. That shorthand is powerful because a complicated frustration becomes easier to aim at when it has one familiar name. Then Gen X grows older, moves into management, becomes the parent, owns the house, runs the meeting, and enters the same frame. A 50-something executive can now look like the cultural picture people already learned to call boomer. The eye notices the role, the age, and the attitude. The exact generation can become secondary. That is how a demographic label starts behaving like an emotional category. It stops asking, "When were you born?" and starts asking what you represent in the things someone is angry about. Gen X once had its own caricatures, but those images were built around distance, irony, independence, and not caring very much. Those traits do not create the same ready-made picture as the older authority figure blocking change from behind a desk. When the complaint is about power, the boomer stereotype already has a costume, a voice, and a place in the story. Gen X can therefore be blamed as an individual while disappearing as a generation. That changes the cultural scoreboard, because repeated mistakes can be remembered under the wrong generational name. Boomers can inherit criticism for behavior committed by people younger than them simply because the stereotype fits the scene. Gen X, meanwhile, can lose an uncomfortable opportunity to ask what its own age group now controls, repeats, or gets wrong. Younger people then receive a cleaner story than reality. One older generation caused the problem while the generation between them fades out. None of this means every criticism aimed at boomers secretly belongs to Gen X. Some arguments concern policies, wealth, institutions, or decisions genuinely associated with particular cohorts. The point is narrower. Once boomer becomes a catch-all villain, accuracy can disappear even when the frustration itself is real. Age also complicates the picture. A habit that looks generational may come from being a boss, a homeowner, a parent, a retiree, or simply the older person in the room. When Gen X reaches those positions, observers can mistake a life stage conflict for proof that they are looking at a boomer. Power complicates it again. People often resent the person who can say no, set the rule, approve the budget, or protect an old system. If boomer already means entrenched authority in someone's mind, the label can attach to whoever occupies that chair, regardless of generation. The result is a strange double distortion. Boomers can become responsible for more than their actual share, while Gen X can appear less involved than it really is. Neither mistake helps us understand which decisions came from a generation, which came from institutions, and which came from ordinary human self-interest. Generational labels are useful because they compress history. They can remind us that people entered adulthood under different economies, technologies, family norms, and expectations. But compression has a cost. Once a label becomes a moral verdict, it starts sorting people by resemblance instead of explaining the conditions that shaped them. That may be one reason Gen X is harder to turn into a lasting villain. Its cultural identity is often less useful as a symbol of authority than the boomer label already is. If another generation already owns the stereotype, every Gen X mistake that resembles it can be filed in the older folder. And invisibility is not the same as innocence. A generation can avoid becoming the symbol of a problem while still participating in the workplaces, markets, families, and institutions where that problem continues. The useful question is not whether Gen X deserves a new pile of blame, but whether our existing labels are hiding responsibility instead of locating it. Watch the process in an ordinary argument. A company announces an unpopular policy. A senior manager defends it. Someone posts the clip, notices the age, hears a familiar tone, and calls the manager a boomer. Within minutes, the person becomes evidence for a story about an entire generation. But several different things have been collapsed. The policy may come from the company, the authority from the job, the attitude from the individual, and the person may actually be Gen X. The label still feels satisfying because it turns a messy chain of responsibility into one recognizable character. That satisfaction is exactly why the error survives. The villain is easier to remember than the structure that produced the decision, and that simplicity keeps the story moving. The same shortcut changes relationships closer to home. A millennial employee can hear "that is how we have always done it" and experience a generational wall, while the Gen X manager saying it may think they are protecting a process that works. A boomer parent can then be blamed for attitudes held just as strongly by a younger sibling, supervisor, or neighbor. Everyone starts arguing with a generation instead of the person in front of them. That does not make generational history irrelevant, it makes precision more important. Different cohorts really did grow up under different conditions. But when the label becomes an accusation, those differences can disappear. One group receives inherited guilt, another receives accidental cover, and the actual behavior becomes harder to examine because the argument has already decided who the villain is. So return to the executive decision, the public meltdown, and the middle-aged complaint. Before calling any of them boomer, ask what the label is actually doing. Is it identifying a birth cohort, describing an attitude, signaling anger at authority, or simply naming the oldest-looking person in the frame? Gen X does not need to become the next generational villain to correct the picture, and boomers do not need to be cleared of every criticism. The better move is to separate history from shorthand and responsibility from stereotype. Generations can help explain the worlds people learn to navigate. They are much weaker as automatic verdicts on who caused a specific problem. Sometimes the Gen X mistake really is a Gen X mistake. Sometimes it is just a bad decision by one person. Either way, blaming the wrong generation teaches us less about both.